Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Some White Guy Mansplains Intersectional Feminism with Jake Ryan. I'm your host, Jake Ryan, and today we're going to be discussing the LGBTQ community and why I think that name is kind of a misnomer. For starters, we're not nearly as communal as we could be. It would be more accurate to call us people with non-normative sexualities and gender identities, but that's not that catchy. I have some friends who like to refer to us as the Alphabet Mafia, and I like that title much better. Part of me likes the idea of embracing the fear others seem to have of us, but then part of me recalls what Morgan Freeman allegedly said about homophobia, which is that it's not a phobia. You're not afraid of anything, you're just an asshole. It's important to understand that LGBT people are not a homogeneous group, and there's a wide array of experiences within each of the letters, which also aren't mutually exclusive. One of the biggest incorrect assumptions I see is people thinking that all LGBT people understand and respect all other LGBT people. I wish that that were true, because we get enough hate from cishet people, and yet there's also a fair amount of infighting, with some going so far as to even send death threats to other LGBT people, sometimes even over things as trivial as liking or disliking a queen on RuPaul's Drag Race. And, applying an intersectional lens, it is often black queens significantly more hate than white queens. There are divisions within the so-called community that I'll address at the end of this episode, but we'll start with discussing the letters that pertain to sexual orientation, the L, G, and B. So, lesbians. They're often portrayed as angry man-haters, in big part because they enjoy freedom from the male gaze. Men get mad because they too have been conditioned to think that women exist simply to be supporting characters to men. Porn involving two women fetishizes the sexual orientation and makes it about the male gaze, but it's not an accurate representation. Porn never is. Women are expected to cater to men, and when they don't do this, many men have a complete meltdown, hence calling lesbians angry and bitter. A lot of men can be assholes, and some have convinced themselves that women who call themselves lesbian just haven't had good dick, which they believe they can provide. This is disgusting and egoic, and it ignores women's right to self-definition, especially when their sense of self doesn't center men. Men who think like this need to critically self-reflect, because their dicks aren't nearly as important or powerful as they might like to think that they are. There was an old research article we read in my first semester of my PhD that said lesbians were often harder to identify, since women had more closeness in their relationships anyway. Some lesbians are butch and identify more with masculinity than femininity, and don't bother aspiring to feminine beauty standards. Some lesbians, on the other hand, are what we call lipstick lesbians, and they enjoy femininity, but not for male attention. In the 1980s, there were about 200 lesbian bars in the US, and now there are fewer than 30 left. This is a big problem, because lesbians deserve their own safe spaces just as much as any other demographic. A big part of this is that lesbian bars are primarily owned and operated by lesbians, and women don't make as much as men, so they're less able to keep lesbian bars open compared to men who own and operate gay bars. There's also the term later in life lesbians, which describes exactly what it sounds like it describes. These women were often married to men for a while because that's what they felt societally pressured into, and then, after realizing that they were unhappy in their relationships, they divorced their husbands and were finally able to be honest with themselves about where their true attraction lies. Finally, the acronym used to be GLB, but the L moved to the front to honor lesbians because they were the primary caretakers of gay men during the height of the AIDS epidemic. I think a lot of gay men are unaware of this, and unfortunately, are often misogynistic and/or lesbophobic, indicating that there's not the strong sense of community that the acronym would imply. Next, we have gays. Gay used to be a slur, but then the term was adopted by this group in the 1960s as a reclamation and a way to describe these men without explicitly referencing sexual behavior, the way the previously used term homophile did, which means same-sex lover. White gay men have become normalized in big part because of our willingness to sell out and become palatable to the general public. One theory holds that the reason that white gay men were able to find acceptance is because of consumer culture. When it became apparent that gay men had money and could also contribute to consumerism, they were deemed more acceptable. Whiteness and masculinity, as we established, are highly valued in our society, and so white gay men, especially masculine ones, were not such a challenge to the status quo. There is, however, a wide spectrum of gay masculinity. Some men struggle to see themselves in the label gay because it is often associated with effeminacy, and while some gay men certainly are effeminate, not all gay men are, nor do they have to be. If you're gay, you're gay, whether you're a muscular jock or a stereotypical femme gay. There's a quote I heard once that said, "It was the drag queen who made it safe for the football player to come out, not the other way around." I mentioned this in the episode on masculinity and men's sexuality, but because it's such a defining experience for the gay community, I think it bears mentioning again that the AIDS epidemic was proof of how much of American society really feels about us. We read an article from the late 1980s or maybe early 1990s in one of my classes that looked at 100 different explanations for how and why AIDS came to be. Originally called GRID, or gay-related immune deficiency, many truly believed that gays were disgusting deviants and that this was God's punishment for being abominations. No one deserves to die of AIDS, and it's disheartening to think that it was considered scientific to create justifications for the mass death that our community experienced under the neglect of the Reagan administration. Then there are bisexuals. Men and women who identify as bisexual experience this differently because patriarchy can't comprehend of a sexual orientation that doesn't cater to or include men. When a woman says that she's bi, people generally assume that it's just a phase and that she'll ultimately end up with a man. When a man says that he's bi, people generally assume he's actually gay and just in denial. This is called bi erasure. It is not your right, nor anyone else's, to decide what someone's identity is. If a person says they're bi, they're bi. There is, of course, nuance to this sexual orientation, like there is with anything else. Bisexual does not mean half gay and half straight. Some bisexuals may have equal attraction to men and women, and others may have a 40-60 split, or a 90-10 split, or anything else. I dated a bi guy briefly once, and he told me that dating was really hard because this attraction could fluctuate at any time, and it was entirely out of his control, though really anyone's attraction is out of their control. He said sometimes it would change after days, sometimes after weeks, sometimes after months, and all he could do was be honest with himself and potential partners about how he was feeling at that time. Another challenge bisexual people face is biphobia, or the fact that because of their attraction to multiple genders, they cannot possibly be loyal in a monogamous relationship. Pansexuality is more similar to bisexuality than it used to be. At one point in time, bisexuals were generally considered to only be interested in cisgender men and women, while pansexuals were considered more trans-inclusive, but labels change over time as our understanding of things changes. A person can identify as bi and date a trans person because not all people who use the same labels understand them the same way. Lastly, there's asexuals, or people who experience little to no sexual attraction to any gender. It's a spectrum, not all or nothing. Some asexuals don't desire sex at all and may not enjoy it, while others may not have strong desire but don't mind, or even enjoy having sex with their partner because it makes them happy to make their partner happy. Demisexual is a subtype of asexuality in which people need an emotional connection in order to have sex. Language is often limiting because some people describe themselves as demi as though it's a sexual orientation. I think it'd be better if it were called something like demi-attraction, so it isn't confused with sexual orientations like homosexual or heterosexual, but we haven't got there yet. Part of my work as a sex therapist is reminding clients that we all experience sexuality differently and that we don't always need to be so quick to pathologize ourselves. Since I primarily work with gay men who internalize the idea that gays are promiscuous, some clients think something is wrong with them, that they can't enjoy meaningless hookups. Those aren't for everyone. Some people need that emotional connection, and some people prefer to have no connection when it comes to sex. There's also aromantic, which can exist along with asexuality or separate from it. LGBT does not include pedophiles. Hateful outsiders often try to lump them in with us to malign us, but being attracted to minors is not a sexual orientation. Consent is always necessary and requires two or more legal adults that have the capacity to consent to sexual activity. Also, the A in LGBTQIA doesn't stand for allies because allies are inherently not part of the community they're supporting. We'll talk more about what real allyship looks like in a later episode. The LGBT acronym, and especially the longer version, 2SLGBTQIA, also includes gender identities like two-spirit and trans. We're going to get into that now. Transgender is an umbrella term and describes anyone who doesn't identify with the gender assigned to them at birth. Cis and trans are literally just scientific prefixes that mean either same or across. I first learned these terms in my undergrad degree in nutrition to refer to cis fats and trans fats. Some people act like cis is a new word or identifier, and some extreme snowflakes, like Elon Musk, have decided that cisgender is a slur. I am cisgender. The gender I was assigned at birth feels right to me, and I have no reason to be offended by this term because I'm not an idiot. Some people are trans. That's just a fact of life. People are far too complex to think that all people with a penis will identify as men and all people with a vulva will identify as women. While some trans people may opt for gender reassignment surgery, not all will. There's no one right way to be trans. Also, social research used to refer to male-bodied and female-bodied people, but then people felt this was somewhat transphobic. Sex is generally thought of as biological, but in reality, it's a social construct too. A person can be assigned male at birth and then identify as a woman and do nothing to change their physical body, making their body a woman's body because they are a woman. Again, there's so much complexity to being human, and we're not all going to fit in the neat little boxes that systems of oppression think we should fit into. People sometimes complain that things are so much more confusing than they used to be, and I'll admit that they are more complex, but that's not a valid excuse to be disrespectful. Language is imperfect, and we may not have developed the right words to be inclusive of all identities yet. We will see more terms come about, and there will be resistance to them, but we should always aspire to provide people with the means to understand themselves, even if it's inconvenient for some people. Next, we have non-binary. This is not simply a third gender identity. It's not just a blend of masculine and feminine, that's bigender, and it's a different thing. The name really is what it says it is. It's a gender identity that is neither man nor woman. I'm non-binary in a sense, because although I feel comfortable being considered a man, I don't like all that comes with it. But in my case, I just adjusted my understanding of what it means to be a man rather than call myself non-binary. It's been said that there are as many gender identities as there are people because a lot of people do what I did. Some will adjust binary definitions to make them work for them, and some simply do not want to see themselves in the gender binary, which is completely valid. Some people critique the term non-binary because it still reinforces the gender binary in its label, but again, it's just an example of how language is an imperfect tool for understanding ourselves. Just because the term isn't perfect doesn't detract from what it means, that a person's understanding of their gender does not have to exist in the binary. I believe it was within the past year that Demi Lovato said she no longer identified as non-binary, and a lot of people acting in bad faith use this as proof that non-binary isn't a real gender identity. However, her real reasoning was because a lot of people are assholes, and she got tired of having to correct people and provide education. As you'll hear me say again and again, it shouldn't be minoritized person's job to provide education, but it often does fall on us because people aren't that committed to learning otherwise. Agender is another term, which means that people who have no gender identity. You don't have to understand it. If the gender you were assigned at birth feels right to you, then great. And if someone doesn't identify with the concept of gender at all, so be it. Next, we have there's two-spirit. This term is generally used by Native Americans and First Nations people to describe those who identify with multiple genders that are neither male nor female. These are mostly just Western cultural conceptualizations. Other countries understand sex and gender differently, so our way isn't even universal. Trans doesn't translate to all other societies, and this speaks to the debate between social constructionism versus essentialism. Essentialists say that these categories exist across space and time, while social constructionists say that these categories only exist in specific contexts and have the meaning that that context gave them. It's not the same as nature versus nurture. One more gender identity to discuss, and this is intersex. Roughly 0.5 to 1.7% of people are intersex, which means that they have ambiguous genitalia, previously called hermaphrodites, and/or their internal organs aren't strictly male or female, or their chromosomes or hormones don't align strictly with one sex or the other. There are people who are intersex who may not even know, and they can have any gender identity or sexual orientation because, as I said, many of the letters in the alphabet mafia are not exclusive of other identities. There's also the Q in LGBTQ, which can stand for queer or questioning. I want to point out that not all LGBT people are inherently queer. To queer something is to disrupt a binary. It's intentionally vague because it resists being defined as any one thing. Being a masculine gay man who hasn't faced his internalized homophobia is not queer. He perpetuates the gender identity, but just happens to like men. Queer coding is a term used to describe the deliberate association of queer identities with immorality. If you look at the villains in lots of Disney movies, like Ursula, Jafar, and Scar, they are portrayed as queer individuals to subliminally instill in people the idea that LGBT people are villainous. This has harmful and lasting impacts on people because cultural conceptualizations aren't just theoretical ideas, they lead to material consequences. As for questioning, there's debate around whether people who are questioning are actually part of the community, but we generally pride ourselves on being inclusive. So if you think that you might be part of us, we're happy to welcome you with open arms. There are also, of course, divisions within our community, and it's why I think it's maybe not always fair to call us a community. We are not immune to ableism, racism, transphobia, biphophobia or bi-erasure, and misogyny. Kim Chi's song at the season 8 finale of RuPaul's Drag Race was called Fat Femination, a reclamation of people's rampant prejudice on Grindr. There's been discourse around people's exclusionary preferences over the past decade, and even if gays aren't always more inclusive, many seem to have learned that openly airing your dislike of certain others isn't acceptable anymore. One of the more divisive groups within our community is the LGB without the TQ crowd. They are no different than Uncle Toms among Black people or misogynistic women. Again, division is a tool of the oppressor, and bigots don't care about nuance. Sure, they might come after trans people first, but people with hate in their hearts aren't going to extend compassion and acceptance to gays, lesbians, and bisexuals just because we're cis. Those who are against us are all too happy to see some of us be willing to throw other community members under the bus and do their dirty work for them. Unfortunately, this really isn't so new. Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera were at the forefront of Stonewall at the beginning of Pride marches, and within 3 years of Stonewall, white gays had already pushed Sylvia out. It's an all too common tale for those with the least privilege to fight for everyone, and then for those with more privilege to abandon the less privileged ones once they've gained some degree of acceptance themselves. The final point I want to leave you with today is something we talked about in my classes. This idea that people should have access to the language to understand themselves without the pressure to disclose their identities. As I said, we're going to see even more terms come into being to help people understand themselves, and this is great, but no one owes you anything, and the expectation that LGBTQ people should have to disclose their identities is stupid. Being cisgender and heterosexual are norms, or identities that have been centered by systems of oppression, but diversity is natural. Being trans is just as natural as being cisgender, and having same-sex attraction, or attraction to multiple genders, is just as natural as being heterosexual. No sexual orientation or gender identity is deviant, and it speaks to power that some are portrayed as such. I think we'd all be much happier if we decentered cis-normative and heteronormative assumptions and learned to appreciate the countless ways there are to experience being human. Until next time, I'm Jake Ryan, and this has been Some White Guy Mansplains Intersectional Feminism.